Hello everybody. Welcome to this, the first of 5 short talks entitled Snapshots of Faith. Each talk will introduce one figure in modern church history. Some are better known than others, but all 5 were people whom God used in a remarkable way in mission, whether in their own country or overseas. They came from very different backgrounds. Today, we will be looking at an English aristocratic lady. The next 2 talks will be about an English shoemaker and a Scottish gardener, and then the final 2 will concern a Chinese pastor and an American woman missionary. Although all 5 were people of remarkable Christian faith, we shouldn't put them on a pedestal. We shall see that they had their faults, and that their lives were sometimes marked by breakdowns in relationships, as well as by personal tragedies. In other words, they were really much like you and me. Today, our focus is on Selena Hastings, the Countess of Huntingdon. She was born as Selena Shirley in 1707 in Northamptonshire. She was a child of a broken marriage and had no relationship with her mother, but was close to her father, the Earl of Ferrers. At the age of 20, she married the 9th Earl of Huntingdon, who rejoiced in the wonderful name of Theophilus. He was rich, and when I say rich, I mean really rich. He owned most of Ashby de la Zouch and Loughborough, not to speak of county estates in Derbyshire and Staffordshire. And then there was the family seat at Castle Donington in Leicestershire, close to where the motor racing circuit is now. By the age of 32, Selena had produced 7 children in rapid succession. But their first child, also called Selena, died in infancy. Then 2 of their sons died from a smallpox epidemic in 1743. Then in 1746, Selena lost her husband at the early age of 49. The final blow was the loss of her last child, Henry, at the age of 19 in 1758. So this was a lady who, for all her wealth and prominence in society, experienced more than her fair share of personal tragedy. In June 1739, at a time of great personal stress in her life, caused by ill health and family arguments over inheritance, Selena found a personal faith in Jesus Christ. She joined the infant evangelical revival movement in England, being influenced by a group called the Moravian Brethren. She became known as a Methodist. Now, Methodism then was not a separate denomination, as it is now, but a movement for spiritual renewal within the Church of England, associated with the great evangelists George Whitefield and John Wesley. Selena became convinced that God was calling her to a special mission, to evangelize the high and mighty in English society, to convert England from the top down. She used to say that she was very grateful for the M in 1 Corinthians 1:26, where the Apostle Paul says, "Not many of you were of noble birth." At least, she reflected, he didn't say, "Not any of you were of noble birth." The Countess organised a house group in her home at Donington, and whenever she went to Bath to take the spa waters, she witnessed to the other fine ladies in the baths. She had a residence in Bath, another in Bristol, another in Tunbridge Wells, another in Brighton, and of course a London townhouse as well. Attached to each of her residences, at her own expense, she built a private chapel and installed a sound evangelical clergyman as her private chaplain. That was a neat way of avoiding the Church of England's insistence that all clergy should be subject to the authority of bishops, few of whom at that time had any sympathy for evangelical convictions. She began building other chapels up and down the country, not all connected to her various residences. But where were evangelical clergy going to come from? There were no theological colleges in those days, only Oxford and Cambridge universities, and in 1768 Oxford expelled 6 students simply for being Methodists. Selena took action. She promptly founded her own training college at Trevecca in the hills of South Wales on property owned by the Welsh evangelical preacher Howell Harris. During the 1770s and early 1780s, she spent half a year at the college, serving virtually as the college principal. She sent out her students on preaching tours throughout the country. She bought them a new outfit every year and even gave them pocket money. She advised them on how to preach, even though she didn't believe in preaching herself as a woman. The students used to refer to her as their commanding officer. There were only 2 qualifications needed to become a student at Trevecca. One was that you shouldn't be married. The other was that you should be clear of Baptist principles. In other words, you shouldn't be a Baptist. The Countess was not very fond of Baptists. She placed little emphasis on educational qualifications. She wanted men who could preach the simple gospel. Perhaps that was a sign that the congregations which were swelling her chapels were not composed of aristocrats after all. The congregations were made up of ordinary working people. The high and mighty were proving harder nuts to crack. The Countess's horizons were not limited to Britain. She commissioned some of her students to preach in Georgia in America, where George Whitefield had established an orphanage. He left it to her in his will when he died in 1770. She hoped that the orphanage would become the base for the conversion of America. The Countess also had plans to send missionaries to India and to Tahiti in the South Seas. By the time of her death in 1791, the Countess had planted up to 80 congregations throughout England, staffed by preachers trained at Trevecca. And although the Countess of Huntingdon's connection still survives today, it is a shadow of its former self. Selena was not very skilled at planning for the succession. She had reluctantly left the Church of England in 1783, the first Methodist leader to do so. But most of her preachers and chapels eventually left her connection to join the Congregationalists. One of the funeral sermons preached in honour of the Countess applauded her as the greatest woman in the cause of the gospel of Jesus Christ that ever lived in the world. You might think that verdict was rather over the top, but she had a single-minded vision for bringing the gospel of Christ to the nation. At first to her own sector of society, but increasingly to a wider audience as well. In an age when women were supposed to be seen but not heard in church life, she showed male Christians what had to be done and then how to do it. She was a complex personality, often anxious and depressed. She displayed an extraordinary ability to fall out with her fellow evangelicals. She and John Wesley parted company over the doctrine of God's election of some to salvation, which she believed in, but he didn't. She also had a massive blind spot over slavery, herself owning slaves attached to the orphanage in Georgia. Yet there is no doubt that for all her faults, God used Selena. Like Whitefield and Wesley, she had a vision for taking the gospel to where people were, rather than expecting them to flock into the existing parish churches. Her students preached in fields and barns and marketplaces. Even the Baptists, whom she found so disagreeable, took up that model of itinerant preaching, moving from place to place, preaching the gospel. Largely as a result of itinerant preaching, the Baptist denomination more than doubled in size, from about 0.5% of the population of England in 1800 to more than 1% in 1850. Perhaps we can conclude that from her vantage point in glory, the Countess might have managed at least half a hallelujah.